sure. Andy probably would know better. But anyway, he came and joined us when I was in Japan, in Tokyo.
And he did his residency there, I think.
That's it.
Yeah.
To
was right
St.
after-
Luke's Hospital. So,
when you first came back from Paris,
yeah.
and then how did you get from New York over to California? By train?
By train.
Oh.
And on the way, of course, my reputation had, I had quite a write-up, the New York Times, and
That's
yes,
wonderful.
I still have some of those clippings.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, on the way, of course, the Japanese community were all very proud of me, and so along the way, they had already established little communities, and I gave concerts along the way, and got to Sacramento, and there I gave another little concert, and then went on to Japan.
When did you decide to go back to Japan?
Well, I had to, because my father was very anxious to return to Japan.
Oh, that's
He was not well,
That's
you
when
see.
he was sick.
Yeah, he wasn't well.
He wanted to go back to Japan.
And of course, the old family, when we got there, was just awful. And he decided that, well, he couldn't live Japanese style. So I think I told you, I mean, the Miyakawa family owned a lot of property and mountains of lumber. And I stayed in Tokyo because most of my manager was there, and they would arrange concert tours. And so when I went on long tours that are interesting tours, like I went into Manchuria.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and then if we had a very interesting tour, we'd like going to the southern part. Isn't that awful? I can't. Kyushu.
That's the southern part of
Southern
Japan.
part.
Yeah. Is that right?
And well, of course, they accompanied me everywhere, and they got to do all the sightseeing because I was performing all the time, and it was a hard life. I mean, one night here and one, you just go on. So.
Did you have a group that accompanied you, or you sang?
Well, I had
whatever?
my accompanist.
Oh, I see. A pianist.
Yeah, pianist. And then my parents.
And what type of things did you sing? Italian operas?
Well,
or French or?
a standard concert, that is a group of classical things, classic, like, French, Italian. You start off with Italian, and then I would have a group of French songs, and then I would have a group of, opera things that was very popular. And then as a last group, I always had a group learned to sing Japanese songs,
right,
which was always a pleasure for them to hear.
Right.
And that ended the program.
Yeah. And you sang just with the piano?
Oh, yes, Then occasionally, in between, they would have, we were just starting to have orchestras, and of course I sang with the Tokyo Symphony, and they had, I guess, so-called symphony in Osaka, which is, just beginning.
Yes.
And but it was an orchestra, and but they had no opera at that time. I wonder why. Because there was a tenor who was in Europe at the time I was singing. And I have to tell you something very funny, because in Europe, in order to get started, you yourself had to be either very good or had a patron and who would pay the theater. You buy the theater for one night or 2 nights.
I see. So it helps to have a rich patron.
Exactly, which I didn't have. And so it was done. Everybody did it, apparently. I didn't know about that. But this tenor, Japanese tenor. He's half English and half Japanese, and very handsome. And had a very lovely voice, but for an opera singer, he didn't have quite the volume.
Mm-hmm.
And so he asked me, he said, how much did you pay? And that was the first time that I ever heard that, you know.
That people actually paid.
Paid, and he wanted to know how much I paid. And I said, no, nothing. They gave me so much, you know. And that really, he was really very surprised.
Mm-hmm. And it made you realize what an honor it was
that
you had
yes.
been selected.
Yeah. It wasn't very much. I don't recall how much it was, but anyway, it wasn't much, but just the same. And it was certainly not enough to live on.
Right. Yeah.
And so in the meanwhile, my father, it never dawned us. My mother never thought of anything like that. And I never knew anything. We were quite innocent about it.
Very naive.
Very much so. So then we, they told me at the opera comique that when I was ready to come back, why I could. And I had already started rehearsing for La Bohème. And so, of course, which meant coaching and voice and acting and all those things that go with it. And so I thought, well, all right, I'll go back to Japan with my parents, and then end up going back to Paris.
And how old were you then? About 19? 20?
I made my debut at 19. Well, they said 19, but I think I was about 20. I just reached 20 or something, but 19 sounded better,
yes,
you know.
Yes. A young blossom.
Yeah, right. 19.
Yes.
So everybody knows me as 19, you know. But
did you date anyone when you were in Paris?
Not as we would call it dating. There was a young man. Well, there were young people in the embassy, the Japanese embassy, and but they were all really gentlemen, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there was one young man who was very nice, and I liked him, but there was another man that I liked better, but this one was very suave, you know. But the funny thing was his mother his father had passed away. I think they were in the diplomatic service before, and the mother flew over from Japan, and she accompanied him, and she was with him all the time. We would go skating about twice a week, but the whole group, never by him alone, but she was right there.
Chaperoning.
Of course, nothing happened, you know.
Right.
My mother was there too.
Right.
And and then the funny thing is, after I married and we were a couple of years later, you know, there was one young man who's he's passed away now, but he liked me and I didn't like him because he was too fat. And but when I got back and we got together and we laughed about Paris, and he said, you know, we always wanted to invite you, but you always ended up by saying, well, is it all right if I brought my mother? This is her mother. You always said that. That's why we never.
That's funny.
And it was funny.
Yeah.
But for me to leave my mother by herself was unthinkable, because when we first got to Paris and rented an apartment, she became so homesick. The apartment was on the 3rd floor or something, top floor anyway, and across the road was this Catholic school. And being a school, the gong would go every 30 minutes or something, you know. And the window was halfway up, being on the attic, you know. Why, all she could see was the sky. and the church bell going gong, gong, gong. And one day when I got back from Sorbonne, she was crying. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, oh, I don't know. I just can't stop crying. So then we thought, well, it's time we got out of here. And that's when we found this nice apartment on the second floor between the École Militaire, the military school, and Napoleon's tomb was on this side, and this little short avenue, Avenue de Tourville, and we were on the second floor, so everything was fine. It was
She could see much more, and
yeah, she was very lonely.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure.
Sure, because I'd leave in the morning and go to school. I'd come back for lunch. Then off I would go for piano lessons, or no, the piano teacher used to come for my voice teacher. At the beginning, it was just singing, getting my voice trained. But then later on, of course, this was after we moved. I didn't get back until 5 o'clock in the
Right, you had a very busy schedule.
Yeah.
And of
So
course
I
she
was
was very lonely, I can understand.
Oh, yes. So, and then she would do the grocery shopping and all that. She was a very strong person. She didn't seem like it, but she was. You had to be, I think.
I think that's true of Japanese women. They're often very soft-spoken and very ladylike, and yet they're steel underneath.
You're not kidding. And we arranged things so that after dinner, we would take a walk on the.
Oh, that's
nice. Every evening we did that,
and you tell her all about your day.
And let's see. There was a garden. I can't remember the name of the garden, but it's the garden between the École Militaire
and Napoleon's tomb.
The Arc de Triomphe was right there.
Oh, it must have been beautiful.
Oh, yes. And on both sides of the garden were these very expensive apartments in those days.
I'm sure still.
Well, I have no idea. Paris has changed a lot.
Well, I'm thinking, when we go to Paris someday, I'm sure we will, I'll go look up and say, and that's where Agnes studied. And
Oh, yeah, and then my singing teacher lived right around the corner of the Arc de Triomphe. Arc de Triomphe, let's see. Right in the center of Paris, because for me too, and for my mother, I felt that we had to be where she would be seeing people. And yes, I think you would enjoy that.
I'm sure someday, when the children are older and they can.
Well, if I'm alive, then I'll go with you.
Okay.
And I'll be the tour guide.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I love that city.
So let's go back to Japan.
Okay.
A little jump in time there, because you traveled across the United States and immediately went over to Japan.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sure your father had to finish up his business and everything in California, and then when he got to Japan,
he went straight over to the country.
To Tsuyama.
Ochiai. Ochiai is the name of the village where
I see.
And yes, and he
didn't
decided,
like the Japanese ways.
That was not something for him. And he went up in the mountains and chopped down these old trees and made lumber American style. And they couldn't understand that, to chop these huge trees and make thin boards out of them, And the Miyakawa-san there's something the matter with his head. Really? But the house is still standing.
Oh, yes, we went to it.
Yeah, it's still standing.
So
Nothing's been done to it.
He built it himself.
Oh, yes.
He must have had help, other workmen.
Oh,
to
yes.
come, and he would
teach
them how to do it.
The whole neighborhood was there, and of course they enjoyed it because they were getting paid for it. And oh, yes. So then
So he lived there, and
Yeah,
your mother
and
was
I
with
lived
him.
in Tokyo.
Did your mother live with you in Tokyo?
Yeah, well, she was sort of this
Back and
way,
forth.
yeah. But
And then
I
you were
needed her.
touring also. You
Oh,
were touring around Japan.
yes, and whenever I went on long tours, my father just dropped everything, and the three of us toured together
And at that time, George was at
St. Luke's.
In Tokyo, and he
But
was
he joined
studying.
us later, you know. Yeah.
And how long was that? How long a period were you in Japan then?
Oh,
A long time.
yes, because in the meanwhile I married.
And that was when you married Dick.
Yeah.
But what was his name in Japan?
Makiyama.
Makiyama?
Mm-hmm.
And what about his last name?
Makiyama.
And his first name?
Takebumi.
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 So your last name, your first married last name was
Makiyama.
And did you sing under that name, or did you?
No,
Yoshiko?
no. Whenever
Miyakawa.
I sang, it was Yoshiko. But when I married, I was kind of, everything was a new experience for me. I was willing to quit. I was really ready to jump into this new life that I was going to go into, and I'm glad I did, because I was able to learn so many nice things, and the war years hadn't touched it yet, and being married to a wealthy family, we enjoyed the nicer things, and so, well, I enjoyed it. His mother was another very fine lady,
and you got along well with her?
Yes, because she was so willing to teach me, and I was ready to absorb whatever I could, you know. And
how did you meet him?
Let's see, I met him on a ship going back to Japan. I met him between Honolulu, Hawaii, and Japan.
Oh. Were you touring or vacationing?
No, this was going back to Japan.
Oh, the very
first trip.
Oh, when you first.
Yeah.
I see.
And well, to be very truthful, it was just a casual acquaintance, and he had just finished McGill. He'd gone to Canada and gone to McGill and finished his schooling there.
Was that in business also?
Yeah. And we were both on the same ship, and we were young, both of us. And we danced and had lots of fun, but that's all. But then afterwards, a year or so later, we would meet casually, and we would be around in the same
Circle
group,
of friends.
Group of friends.
That's in Tokyo.
That's in Tokyo. And whenever I had time, I would be invited to these parties, and we really had a good time. Then, of course, a go-between came.
Really?
Yeah, and they said, the Makiyama family would like very much if you would marry their son. And I said, well, I don't know him well enough. And of course I was thinking in terms of American
Right,
way,
American ways versus Japanese.
And I said, well, I'd like to know him a little better, and could we sort of resume this at the end of, at least be engaged for about 6 months, at least. And they said, oh no, that's impossible. I said, why? Well, the father had cancer.
Oh, and they wanted him to be married?
Yeah, safely married so the father can die in peace.
Right.
And I thought it over all night. And I thought, gee, what'll I do? I want to go back to Paris, but that required having more money. And I hadn't paid any attention to the money end of it. I would give concerts and all that, but my father took care of everything.
And you had a manager too.
Yeah, the manager went ahead and made all the arrangements and so on. So finally I said, all right, if he's going to die, why, in 2 months or something, I said, well, yeah, well, let him die in peace.
So what type of a wedding did you have? A Japanese ceremony
enormous.
with the headdress?
Yeah. The custom then, we married in a church. So I had married in a nice veil.
Like an American,
American,
a white long dress. And
And then for the reception, there were, of course, his father was a very big businessman. And really, it was sort of a social thing for him, you know. And all the important people came. And the custom is for the bride to change in mid reception while everybody was eating. Then she would disappear, and then she would come out in her elegant kimono. And did I wear a wig then? No, I don't think so. I don't think for the wedding ceremony. Well, this was not the ceremony. This was just the reception. But then I had changed back into my white gown again, and when the guests left, while we were on the receiving end and saying goodbye and so forth.
What was your hair like for your wedding?
Oh, I had long hair then.
It was long? Was
Yeah,
it straight
and,
or curly?
Well, I used to wear curl my hair, and I used to have one strand of curl down one side. I don't know whether it was this side or this side.
And the rest you would wear up?
Yeah, the hair, and then I'd wear a bun in the back.
I
mean, yeah, I don't think I wore it up. And
it pulled back, and then you
yeah,
have one little
sort
strand.
of a wave, you know, this way.
Oh yeah.
And it became sort of a fashion among the young people, young girls, and there used to be so many girls who would have the curls hanging down.
Isn't that funny?
My fan were schoolgirls, because I was young, and they felt that I was younger than I was, you see. So most of my concerts, not most, but the day concerts were at the girls' schools. And it's very nice. And at night, of course, it was for the general public.
So, let's see, you got married. That must have been a real shock. And then, then you gave up your career.
Yeah, practically.
You stopped singing.
I know one concert that I gave, and that was Dick's mother was a Christian, one of those real Christians, you know. And she belonged to this church, and they wanted to have a concert. And so I gave my last concert, really, for that, because she didn't mind that. This was for the church. So, so we gave a concert. Oh, and I remember there was a young pianist who studied in Paris at the same time that I was there. He was very good, but very nervous. And he went through this, and all of a sudden he stopped. He forgot. He forgot his music. And the poor thing, he tried several times, and he'd come to this one spot, and he couldn't.
And he'd stop. And what were you doing in that?
Well, I was just standing in
there waiting.
Side, yeah, wondering what in the world he was going to do. Finally, he got back with the music and went on with the concert.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, he was so embarrassed, poor thing. Yeah. But I don't know, I've lost track of him. But
what was his name?
Gee.
Okay, that's not important.
No, I can't remember.
So that was your last concert.
That was really my last concert. We gave it at this so-called largest hall in Tokyo. At that time, they probably have a larger one. Hibiya Hall. Kokaido is the word for auditorium. But yes, that was the last concert. Then after that, of course, I taught.
Oh, you taught voice?
Oh, yes.
And piano too, or just voice?
No, just voice. And I was already connected with the Columbia Recording Company. I had my original recording, I don't know if you have it, but it was in Paris. And I had been under contract with the Columbia people.
Mm.
And so I made recordings. And
They were in Japan then, or
yes, in Japan.
Uh-huh.
They were not very good at it, I'm afraid. Some of it was good, some of them, and
Too bad they didn't have
the
laser discs,
equipment was
the
just
compact
awful.
discs.
They
Yeah.
would say, well, when you take a high voice or if you go into a crescendo or loud, turn your head or move back. No, you don't do that anymore. They do it for you.
Right. They control it with all their little buttons and knobs.
Well, that was the way it was done in those days. So really, it's not satisfactory. But I don't know this man that is my old fan, whom I didn't know and I still don't know. He has made a collection. He asked different people who might have recordings, my old recordings, and he taped them, and he sent me a tape.
Really?
And but some of it sounds so terrible. And I have a recording of myself and the butterfly, but my father had it, and evidently he's just played it and played the scratch of the. I had, when I was over there, I saw it and I said, this I want to take, and I just picked it up and brought it back with me. But
And it's really scratched.
Then I went to Columbia and asked if they might have some of the old plates that they, normally they said no, during the war much of it was destroyed. And so I just have the scratched up recording of my father.
So let's see, you were living in Japan, married to Dick.
And I had Seiko.
And how old were you when you had Seiko?
Oh, let's see.
About 25?
I guess, something like that.
And at that time, George was still there studying, or
Yes,
had he gone back?
No, he was with St. Luke's. And then George wanted to come back because he wanted to specialize in orthopedic and surgery. And he wanted to come to study under Dr. Steiner. And so I think Dick was instrumental in sponsoring that, and well, financially, shall we say. And I think, I don't recall exactly how much it was. It was something like $3,000, but in those days, that's a lot of money. Yeah. And
is
but
that when he went to Iowa?
Yeah. But my understanding is that he paid it all back to Dick, and I don't know that part of it. I was just sort of instrumental in saying, don't you think it'd be a nice idea if George needs this training and he wants to go? Okay, well.
And in the meantime, Kay was starting to practice law. Was he in Japan or he stayed in California?
No, he came to Japan, and then, I know what the story about Kay was. In those days, I think it was still in a slight depression or something, and jobs were hard to get.
Here in America?
Yeah, in America.
When was that? That would be in the early 40s?
Oh, earlier than that.
35 maybe,
yeah,
1935.
I'm not too sure.
That's right, yeah, it would have been, because you went to Paris in 29, and so it would have been around early 33.
Yeah, 33 or 34, someplace around there. And he finished law school, but couldn't get a job. And so they said, well, come and join us. So he lived with us. And what happened then? Oh, yes. And then, well, he had a very good friend whom I think they were roommates. Furukawa. Does that name say anything to you? Well, anyway, he was a son of I think he's a baron, very wealthy. They had copper mines and so on. And then Kay decided that, well, he's got to do something. And the Japanese government was looking for, and that's right, looking for, well,
Ambassadors?
yeah, no, legal,
Oh.
legal person who knew American English and American law and all that, and Kay came in. But his Japanese was so poor that, oh, that man, brother of mine just studied so hard. He got to a point where he could really write and read and everything. And so they took him as a diplomat. And they sent him, I think things were getting kind of bad in China.
Right.
And so he and his wife, in the meanwhile,
This was Toyoko.
Toyoko, yeah. And they were in China when the war broke out. And of course they were recalled. And I remember they had been in China for several years, and I think they had a lot of nice things, but when they came back, they were only allowed to bring one suitcase. Two. There were two.
Right.
So they just came back with their clothes, you know. And but they had his job was waiting for him. So
Still as a diplomat?
Yeah, as a diplomat. And the last was that he was stationed in London. This was after the war, of course. And he was first secretary there. And that was when I had already left Dick, returned to the United States, and I was working, typing, learn how to type, which I never did before, you know. And I got one of those army books that they give to the boys to learn to type.
Oh.
I learned and I taught myself how to type.
Well, now, back to Kay for just a minute.
Yeah.
What about his children? Did he have children?
No children.
No children?
No children.
What about Bobby, or Robert?
Bobby is a cousin.
Oh, he's a cousin.
My father, remember I said his brother came over and he gave the drugstore, the original drugstore to his brother.
Oh, yeah.
He's the son. Bobby is the son.
Okay. But he ended up going back to Japan.
Yes, but he's with the Japan Times or something, some newspaper.
Oh, he's a journalist.
Yeah.
I see. I knew he was involved with the Olympics.
Yes, that's right.
He was on the Olympic committee.
That's right.
So
And so was Kay.
Oh.
Kay was one of the so-called, they call them governors, you know, advisor on the top. And Bobby was a reporter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. I need to get all these things in the
Yeah,
right little
surely.
family tree here on the right branch.
Right. Well, he was a cousin.
I see. And did you know him? Were you?
As Bobby,
Well,
as
you
a
know.
child. Let's see. Yeah, I know him, but he was just a child.
Oh, he was
I was
different
little.
generations. Sort
Yeah,
of.
right.
Yeah.
And by then I was busy.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so how old was Seiko when you left Dick? Was she just a little
She was
girl?
about 7 years old.
7?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. So you stayed married to him for
Oh, I stuck it
8
out,
years.
really.
Yeah. And it was not very happy?
No, well, towards the end when I caught on what was going on, then
Oh,
it
what
became
was
very
going on?
unhappy. But up to that point, it was an easy life, and everything was new. I was learning Japanese. I even went to
Calligraphy school?
calligraphy.
Yeah, calligraphy.
And also flower arrangements, and well, I did learn how to cook because we had servants who did all that. But thoroughly enjoyed learning all those things, you see, and enjoyed, well, it was a nice, easy life until I found out that, well,
He was messing around.
yeah. He would go off on business trips and he'd come back and he'd say, you know, while I was a so-and-so, one of the maids was very nice, and when he said nice, I just took it as being nice.
Yes,
You know?
uh-huh.
Now, would I get her a little present? And so that stupid.
Ah.
So I would buy a little sash or something, you know.
And you ended up sending his
yeah, his little
mistresses presents.
And I finally found out, what was it that really brought it to a head at the start? Well, this is not a nice thing to say, but he was not well, shall we say, and each time he came back from a trip, I was not well.
Uh-huh.
And I would have to go to
The
a doctor.
Uh-huh.
And this doctor was trained in New York. So we spoke English, you know, and
Oh,
it was
how
very
nice,
nice.
yes.
And, but it just got to be something that happened so often. She'd say, Mrs. Makiyama, again, you know,
yeah.
and it was really getting bad. And besides, although she treated me and was, you know,
You'd be-
free of the disease, mentally it was getting to me.
Right.
You know, and I'd see someone, and it got to a point where I was really, I'd look at the servants and I'd say, gee, I wonder, you know.
Uh-huh.
And then
So
I would take Seiko and go to the country once a year for about a week to be with my folks. And of course, while I was away, I don't know how he had managed it, but his mother would be off someplace else, and he would bring in his girlfriends to the house. And one of my neighbors, she said, "Oh, you know, he was having a lot of parties and lots of noise, and." Really, it was getting a little difficult.
Yeah.
And so I asked his mother, I said, you know, Dick isn't really behaving himself well, and as a result, I end up being sick. And this is not the first time, she said. She was the old-fashioned type.
And very Christian.
Yeah, very Christian. Oh, I said, I'd like a divorce. You know, and so I told her what had taking place, and she said, "Oh, the young people nowadays know so much about diseases and sicknesses that, well, I'll have." She said, "Takebu, you come here," and he would sit down, and I would sit down on one side of the table, and she would sit there, and she would tell him, "Now you get rid of this person. Give her the money." That's the way they did.
Oh.
Give her the money and get rid of it. That's all. And I thought, oh my gosh, is this all I'm going to, you know, have to. I expected a little bit more from his mother. But that's all. She just said, give her the money and get rid of her.
About you?
No,
about his
whatever.
girlfriends.
Yes.
Oh.
So that's the way they settle things, you know. If you have the money, give them the money and get rid. Isn't that?
Pay them off.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's probably what his father used to do. Because, you know, in Japan it was a big businessman. He wasn't important unless he had a girl all over the place, and he did. And so the thing was, if it got too complicated, like, give him the money, give her the money and get rid of her. I don't know if he ever did or not, but I caught one. I happened to answer the telephone, and a man voice said he'd like to speak to Dick. So I said, all right, and I called Dick, and we had for some reason, sneaky me, I had a telephone installed in the living room, up in the bedroom, and one in the kitchen. Then I noticed that he was in the living room, so I said, oh, there's a phone call for you. And instead of picking up the telephone that's right there, he rushed off to the kitchen and was answering the phone. And then I followed him, and he seemed terribly embarrassed. And I just snatched the telephone, and the voice had changed from a man's voice to a woman, and she was screaming because he hadn't been over to see her for a while. I gave it back to him and then walked off. I had nothing further to say.
And that was really the end.
Yeah, really for me.
And then you said you really did want the divorce, and
well, there was no point in even saying anything. The war came on, and Kay was already in Sendai, a place called Sendai, and the boys knew all about this. Even George, I know George always said, come and live with me, because at that time he wasn't married, you see. And he said, I'm making enough money, don't worry, come over. And my other brother, June was settled in Sacramento, so. But Kay always understood, and he said, come and live with us, which I did. I just walked out. I just said, look, I can't take this. And then, of course, Seiko would come to visit, and Dick would come, and I said, no, I think I would like to go back to America and think things over. That's what I did. And I asked Seiko, I said, Seiko, I'm going to America, and would you like to come with me? And the poor little thing, that little mind, she just thought for a little while, and she said no, she didn't want to go.
Of course, frightening.
Yeah,
Different
and
language.
For me too, it was frightening because I didn't know what I was getting into. I know George would take care of my living and so on, but that's different. That's not quite enough, like having a home. And no, she said she wanted to stay. So that was the end of Seiko and myself.
So where did she live then?
In Tokyo with
your father.
Dick, yeah.
Oh, I see. And she was well cared for with the servants and the
then
maids.
and the mother had returned to Tokyo, and I think the mother, the grandmother that is, was running the place, But our home was completely destroyed. There's nothing left, excepting the ground was large, and I had been getting the Good Housekeeping magazine, and we thought, well, with all this property, why don't we build a typical American house, which we did, and we rent that to the people in the American Embassy. And but of course during the war, but strange enough, the main house, the beautiful house, was completely destroyed. But this little house was right there, right on the cliff, and it didn't even have a scorch sign.
Isn't that amazing?
Nothing. Whereas General Togo's place was destroyed across the road, all around. I guess there was the wind circled around this little house, and it was when I got back,
what part of Tokyo was that? What part of Tokyo was that?
Oh, the central part of Tokyo. The most expensive.
What's the name of it?
Near the American Embassy. Azabu. Azabu was the name of that part. And the American Embassy was within walking distance, and that was intact too. Probably that had something to do with it.
Yeah.
But Oh, yeah, it's, well, you can't look back and regret because I have no regret. Well,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
Seiko survived
it's all
the,
experience
yeah.
and knowing how people live, not just the working people, because I have worked, and what the wealthy people, how wealthy people
You've
live.
lived several different lives,
Oh,
haven't you?
mhm. So I can cope. I learned to cope,
Yeah.
and if you make up your mind, well, here it is. That's the way it is.
You're a survivor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, before the war, you went back to America, or was that? You said the war was just starting when you left Dick.
Oh yeah.
Right?
And then the war
So
broke out
Then you lived
with my
Kay.
folks. Oh,
In
Kay
Sendai.
came and joined us. Yes.
Oh, I see.
Uh-huh.
And so then they were living in where in?
Kay?
No, you
No.
said you when you left your husband you.
Oh, yes, I joined Kay.
And he was in Sendai.
Yes.
And then you went back to your parents also.
No, I didn't.
No.
Well, I made a visit, but when my mother died.
Oh, I see. And when was that? You know, 45 maybe, 44.
Yeah, something like that. 40, 45 maybe. And I remember, that ride on the train. We were not. There was a train, I think, for the American Army people. And, we, since I was working, I got a job, American Club in Sendai. Also, I had a job for a so-called secretarial job for a colonel. He was judge advocate of that of Sendai. He was the top man.
Head of Sendai.
Very nice person, and we became very good friends. And I told him what my situation was. No, he just thought that was just terrible. And so I worked as a typist. I mean, a very poor typist.
But you spoke English very well.
Yeah, well, that was my forte. You know, I spoke English and I spoke Japanese.
Right.
And so it was very good. And let's see, that's when.
Then you went to your mother's funeral and you had to ride the train.
Yeah, right.
How did she die?
Cancer.
Oh.
You know the Miyakawa family. My mother died, and George.
What type of cancer did she have?
Stomach.
Stomach cancer.
Yeah, she didn't smoke or she didn't drink.
Yeah.
See, but she had stomach cancer.
Yeah. And
Let's see, when did she die? I was still no, that was before I decided to go to live with Kay, I guess.
Oh, I see.
Because I was monitoring, oh boy, I have to go back, monitoring the radio programs, and making a report. That's right, I had to type this report. And I remember the captain who was in charge, I sent in my report. He came and said, "You've got a lot of numbers here." I was typing numbers
instead of the letters.
And he was so good, he laughed, but he said, "What are these numbers?" Goes to show you how difficult it was for me.
Yeah.
But everybody was, at that time, I think everybody was tired of war. And something like me who comes along and types and types and hands in something with nothing but numbers on there.
Oh, that's funny. Probably thought it was a secret code.
I said, what are these numbers here? Captain Orr. That's, I don't know what his first name was, but it was Captain Orr. And then I think, yeah, that was, George kept saying for me to come back to the United States. And this was before he was married. And I thought, well, all right, I'd like to go back.
Was he in Charleston then?
Yes, yes, that's right. He had just, well, I guess he was, I don't know. But I said, all right, I'll come back. But in those days, we were not, all of us, allowed to just pack up and leave.
Right.
And
But you were an American citizen.
Yeah, but the thing was, I had given it up because I had been married to a Japanese citizen.
I didn't know that.
But I had a friend in the embassy, and she was a former musical comedy star. She sang in the first Rosemary show.
Oh, yeah.
La da da dee da da da, la da 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 dee da. And she said she sang the Indian Love Call. Well, we became very friendly because of our music. She and I would stay at her house if sometimes, and she never stayed at our place, but she lived very nearby because of the embassy. So we saw a lot of each other, and of course they always invited us to the American Club, which was the thing to belong to. And since Dick he had money yet, you know, we saw a lot of her. Well, she had some friends too in the embassy, of course. And unbeknownst to me, they had fixed it over so that I was still registered in the American.
Like dual citizenship.
Yeah, but outwardly I didn't have dual citizenship. I was a Japanese citizen, you see. But they had done that for me, so when I needed to come back, but I had no problem. Of course, George had a friend who was a colonel, and when he came to Japan, the first thing he did was to look me up. And he told me all about this, and he said, anytime you want to go back, why, he would vouch for my loyalty and what else, that I would not become government. Anyway, that financially George would take care of me, and I had no problem. So it just went like that. And this colonel that I worked for, he told me now, he said, Agnes, you know, it's right after the war, and people are not going to be as friendly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because you're Japanese.
Right.
So be prepared. And he was so good. Be prepared. I was. And then when I got to San Francisco and I looked down, and there was George, but there was somebody else with him. And it was Hallie. They had gotten married, you know, because, well, I don't know, they had been good friends probably. And, but they were, it was a sort of a surprise, you know, I saw this girl.
She was surprised too.
They probably knew about that, about me coming over, but it was kind of funny, but she was so pretty. Well, she was always. She's like you. I mean, she was tall and beautiful legs. And very, very, she was not fat then. She was very, very beautiful. So anyway, that was my introduction to Hallie from the boat down.
Walking down the ramp.
Yeah, I looked down and there they were, two of them. And anyway, it was very nice. We got along okay.
What color was her hair?
Her hair?
Was it dark? Or?
No, it was a little like yours. I don't recall.
I think I better check and see how much tape is left.
Boy, this is a long interview, but I wander from here and there, you know.
We're just progressing right along. So, there you were in San Francisco.
Yeah.
They met you when you came off the boat, and then you took the train back?
Yes, train, and they dropped me off at June's place.
Oh, they did?
He was over in Denver, I think,
Oh,
near
okay.
Denver, Colorado.
Mhm.
What was the name of the place they were no longer in camp because she taught Japanese to the American soldiers, I guess
Oh,
that's what it
uh-huh.
was. So they were,
And that was
then,
Hideko?
huh?
Hideko?
Yeah. And so I don't know, we never did talk about those days.
But he had been in a camp.
Yeah, they had both been, I think,
Yeah.
but no one has mentioned it, and I never asked.
And what about Bunky? Bunky?
Yeah, Bunky.
That's their son?
Yeah, I don't know. I really.
Did they
don't-
have other children?
You mean June and? Oh yeah, Marilyn and
Oh, okay,
Carolyn
those are the-
and Bunky.
Oh, okay, they had all three. Those are that same generation.
Uh-huh.
Okay, those are Andy's cousins.
Yes, right, right.
Okay.
Do they correspond with you folks or
No,
not?
no, I think that
They're a little strange.
Andy, spent some time with them when it was June's funeral.
Oh yes.
Andy went to represent Pop
Oh, yeah,
because
uh-huh.
Pop was sick at that time.
Mhm.
And so he went to California or Oregon, I think,
Mhm,
for the
mhm.
funeral. Washington, wherever it was.
I wish I had not gone, but I hadn't kept track very well, and so I did send them a check and for condolence and so on. But
Anyway, so there you were dropped off in Denver,
yeah.
and this was Hallie and Pop's honeymoon, right?
Yes, that's
They had
right.
just
They were
gotten married.
honeymooning, so it worked out just right. I don't know where they went after they dropped me off, and then we met again in Chicago at Palmer House.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and gosh, I don't recall too much.
Was that
Paul-
still while they were honeymooning, or was this
Yeah,
like
right.
a year later? This was
No, this
a
is
few
all
weeks.
extension of
Ah.
San Francisco.
Uh-huh.
And